This live recording is from Jubilee Church, Solihull, a community of people that know who we are, what we've got, and what we're called to do.
So we're looking at Hebrews chapter 2 today, which obviously comes after Hebrews chapter 3. That makes sense, doesn't it? Because Rob did chapter 3 last week, but he very kindly swapped with me for reasons I won't go into, but I needed to swap. So, Hebrews, what a book. We have seen so far that Jesus is greater. We've heard Tom talking about Jesus being greater than the angels. We heard Rob last week talking about Jesus being greater than Moses and us being in the household of God. This morning we're going to look again at Jesus being greater, being the greater man. Because we're going to look at the way that Jesus became a man, fully human. The way that he suffered for us and what that means for us as we live, as we suffer and as we change. What we're going to see this morning is something of the upside down nature of the kingdom as well. You may have heard phrases like that in terms of the first being last and the greatest becoming the least. It's an astonishing thing, but we'll unpack a little of that as well. We're going to look at something called the incarnation. Jesus becoming fully human. And we see him suffering, but we see a great salvation as a result. So let's look at the passage. I'm going to read the whole of chapter 2. I'm not going to preach on the whole of chapter 2. Some of it's already been covered, but I'm going to read all of chapter 2, and it should come up as well on there. There's 3 slides of text for the passage, so it's quite a long one. Let's go. So, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. It is not to angels that he has subjected the world to come about which we are speaking. But there is a place where someone has testified, "What is mankind that you are mindful of them? A son of man that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honour and put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present we do not see everything subject to them. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honour because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, "I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly I will sing your praises. And again, I will put my trust in him." And again he says, "Here am I and the children God has given me. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. Wow. I mean, in some ways we can just read that and say, let's just read that 2 or 3 times and that's enough. That's all we need today, because there is so much there. We, mankind, needed to be saved. We needed a saviour. But how was that ever going to happen? A sacrifice was needed. A perfect and spotless sacrifice to take the sins of the world. To take the wages of sin, as the Bible talks about it. To stand in our place. To taste death instead of us. But how do you find someone who's qualified for that? Someone who can be a perfect sacrifice on behalf of the human race. It needs to be someone fully human, but perfect. Look around you. It's not us, is it? The writer in this chapter of Hebrews says this, but there is a place where someone has testified, he's quoting the Psalms here. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? A son of man that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honour and put everything under their feet. She's talking about Jesus being made a little lower than the angels. Remember, Tom, when he spoke to us, told us that Jesus was greater than the angels. But here, Jesus, the Son of God, God himself, sets aside that greatness, sets aside that majesty to become a man, to become fully human. Jesus becomes the truest expression of mankind. Fully human and perfect. Just as creation was intended. Just as Adam and Eve were before the fall. This was the perfect symmetry to creation that was needed to stand again in the face of temptation. So as Adam and Eve had stood in the face of temptation and fallen, that needed to be repeated without the fall. Jesus became a man, was tempted in every way, lived a perfect life as a human being so that he could be the perfect sacrifice and triumph where Adam failed. Perfect symmetry, the perfect sacrifice, the only way it could happen. And the writer to Hebrews sort of goes through this multiple times in this chapter. Verse 14, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil. You see, it's tempting that we could look at this and say, well, he kind of had to, there's no other option. And while Jesus did this willingly, it was far from ideal. But actually the writer addresses that. In verse 10, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. It was fitting. How can that be that it was fitting for Jesus to come and suffer in our place? And that he was made perfect through that suffering. It was fitting. What this means is not that, well, there's no other way, we better do this. But actually, no, this is appropriate. This is right. This is fully in line with the character of God. You see, if he hadn't done that, it wouldn't have been in line with his character and he'd have not been God. But because he's God, in his perfection, he says this is fitting and right that I should do this. But what about that other phrase there in verse 10? That Jesus was made perfect through his suffering. How bizarre a phrase is that? because actually he was already perfect. So what is it saying here? What it's saying here is that Jesus it's almost saying he was completed. There was a wholeness. There was a completion about what he did. It's not that he wasn't perfect and had to become perfect through this, but that he was perfect, but there was a completeness in him doing this. Again, it speaks of the rightness of him doing it. There's a wholeness to it. There's a perfection to this. Over and over, the writer in this chapter talks about Jesus becoming human and suffering in our place. Verse 18, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. He was fully human, and was able to identify with us in our humanity, and then overcome the fall of humanity by being the perfect sacrifice. And what's the result of this? Well, I want to highlight a couple of things. Firstly, as we've already seen, and we've sung about today, our salvation. This is no small thing. It's why we're all here today doing what we're doing. In verse 11, it says, both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Just dwell on that for a moment. We are all here today because of the sacrifice that Jesus made when he became fully human. He then brought us together into his family, which is why we're here. And he is not ashamed of you. How? I mean, that's just... I can't even get my head around that. He is not ashamed. And that's not because he thinks you're doing good things. It's not based on what you do or don't do. It's based on the fact that he saved you. And there's nothing you can do about that, one way or another. So whatever you do this week, Jesus says, I'm not ashamed of you. Whatever happened to you last week, Jesus says, I'm not ashamed of you. If there's nothing else you remember today, remember that. That you go into the world saying, Jesus, who is God, is not ashamed of me. Hold your chin up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whatever's happened, it's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. It's the good news of the gospel, isn't it? You're brought into the family. We are brought into the family. And then verse 14 and 15. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. The devil is defeated, and those who were in slavery, mankind, have been set free. It's great news. But can I suggest that it doesn't always feel like that, does it? Unless it's just me. But I don't wake up, when I wake up, I'm not a morning person, so when I wake up in the morning, it's not a pretty sight. And, it may not be for the rest of the day, but it certainly isn't in the morning. And I, for one, don't always feel like I'm living in freedom. I don't feel like I'm living in victory every day. In fact, if I'm totally honest, it's probably more the other way around, that occasionally I feel like I'm living in victory, that I've got freedom. We don't always feel like it. But guess what? The writer in Hebrews addresses this as well. And this is the second of the two things coming out from this. Verse 7 to 9. You made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honour, put everything under their feet. in putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet, at present, we don't see everything subject to them. There we go. The writer's addressing reality here. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, who is now crowned with glory and honour because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. You see, we read that Jesus has won. We read that he's defeated the devil and that everything is under his feet. But the writer says, yet at present we don't see everything subject to them. We don't see the result of that fully. You may have heard the phrase about the kingdom of God, the now and the not yet of the kingdom of God. It's a very often quoted phrase. And this is a classic example here. Because we live in the truth of what Jesus has done because he became human and died in our place. He's defeated the enemy, but we're still living in a fallen world. We're still subject to the consequences of sin, even though we're not held in slavery to sin. We have a lot of what Jesus has won for us, but not all of it. We won't have all of it until he returns. Although that doesn't stop us from asking for more. But this does not negate or diminish what he has done for us. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us when we're living in this tension of it's done but it's not fully realised? See, we know that in the fully human life that Jesus lived, he experienced what we experience. His body was that of a human. It wasn't a resurrection body. He had that after the cross. This one was subject to all the aches and pains that we experience and increasingly experience as we get older. He was tempted. He suffered grief and loss. He suffered betrayal. We saw earlier that Jesus needed to become the perfect human so he could be the perfect sacrifice. But also, he wanted to be a God that identified with us. He was no longer as remote as he had seemed to many in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, he drew close to some at particular times. Now it's different. Because here he was in the New Testament, flesh and blood, walking with people, hugging people, crying with people, suffering all the things that they suffered. When we go through dark times, we know we have a God who has been there and experienced it before us. He's not standing on the touchline cheering us on at arm's length. He's lived it already. And this is good because we know we've not yet experienced the fullness of all that Jesus accomplished on the cross. So we know we experience suffering. We know we are going to suffer. It is a part of life. The Bible's very clear on that. Don't say this lightly. It's not nice to suffer. We've all got stories of how we have suffered. We've had people here at Jubilee, and you've suffered. Even in the last 12 months, we've got people who have gone through cancer, who have lost people, who've had difficult family circumstances, difficult work issues. Simon alluded to this when he introduced me. Bear with me as I struggle to get through this bit. But this year our family have suffered more than we ever have before. To be honest, more than I ever want to again. Many will know, some may not, that we lost our beautiful granddaughter Josie last Christmas. It was horrendous. It was awful. We suffered. Can't even begin to describe the pain that we went through. Not just me, but those, you see those around you love suffering as well. It's horrible. As I say, I can't even describe how painful and how dark a time that was. And we need to remember that suffering is not just about suffering for the gospel. I think we often look at suffering and think, well, I'm not suffering as a result of being a Christian, so does it really qualify as suffering? Yes, it does. Suffering is suffering, whatever the reason. We don't suffer for the gospel much in this country, in terms of for our faith. Although I think that's going to come. But we suffer just like everybody else in a fallen world that has not yet seen the fullness of God's kingdom. We're told to take up our cross daily. I'm not sure I like that. I'm just being honest. It's all right to read it, but then when it gets to the point where it breaks you, it's not nice. We're not immune from this. And in some ways, I think, as Christians, it makes it harder when we go through this. You kind of think, well, it should be easier because I've got God to rely on. But actually, it makes it harder because you begin to question who God is. You ask some really difficult questions of yourself and of God. Rob touched on this last week, and I think it bears repeating. We believe in a God who is compassionate, who is love, who loves us. But I can tell you this, last Christmas I questioned that. I asked questions. I didn't get to the point where I didn't believe in God, but I did question his character. I did question whether he really was good. Here on a Sunday, there were songs I could not sing because they were about the goodness of God. And I would stand here and not sing and think, really? Really? Is he? I know that sounds shocking, but it's real, isn't it? We get to that point where we go, is he? It's what pain does to you. Remember on the cross, when Jesus died, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you gone? And that's how it feels sometimes to us. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called A Grief Observed. And it's about when his wife died. And when he wrote it, it didn't come out under his name. It was came out under a pseudonym. Nobody knew it was him that had written it. And he says this, I'll quote a big chunk here, but he says this. After his wife had died, he said, meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you're tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. And after that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once. And that seeming was as strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so very absent a help in times of trouble? There was a man suffering deep, deep grief. C.S. Lewis goes on to say, not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not so there's no God after all, but so this is what God's really like. Deceive yourself no longer. Those are strong words. But sometimes we've got to face up to the reality that we ask these questions. Don't deceive yourself by trying to hide from them. It's okay to ask these questions. It's okay to express it. The thing we have to remember, though, and it's easier to say now, and it took a lot of study and soul searching to get to this place. But as far as God's goodness is concerned, it's kind of down to how we define goodness. It was a number of months into the year, and I was just writing lots of stuff down as it came into my head. Some of it I will never share with anybody. Some of it I'm not proud of. It's just what was in my head. I think if you asked anyone, then goodness towards them means something good happening to them. Something good by their definition of what is good. Therefore, if God is good to us, the expectation is that the things he does for us and to us will be pleasant and make us happy. That's a self-centered understanding of goodness. That need for it to benefit me. It must be something I like. God's goodness must be something I like. Notice the amount of times I've said I in the last few sentences. But we pick up our cross daily and die to self. And sometimes we don't realise just how painful that is. I have lived a very easy and blessed life. Very comfortable life. It's only now that I'm starting to understand some of these things. And I've been going to church and part of the church and a Christian for most of my long life, I was going to say. We die to self, and even simple concepts like goodness are so far outside of our understanding. But in the end, God's goodness is summed up in Hebrews 2, in the fact that Jesus came as a man and suffered for us. That is goodness. And as I stood here this morning, we worshipped. I got much of my family around me and this family around me. I went, that is God's goodness. That doesn't change. What changes is how I'm feeling. He knew that we would suffer. Jesus knew that we would suffer because of a fallen world. So he came to show us that we could identify with him, and he identifies with us. He came so that we could be part of his family. We identify with Christ in his suffering. Something else to remember is this. When Jesus was on the cross and he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was very much alone. He was alone in a way that none of us ever are alone. Because at that point, as shocking as this is, his Father turned his face away. Jesus took on the sins of the world and was separated from God so that we don't have to be. There is the goodness of God. Our Father will never, ever turn his face away from us. His face will never be turned away from you. Never. Because Jesus came as a man and suffered in our place. And grief and other suffering, it's like a blanket that just smothers you. Now, this is a quote from somewhere, and I could not remember where from. I hadn't written it down when I wrote this down. So whoever it's from, forgive me. But grief and suffering is like a blanket that smothers you. You can't see God or others. All you can see is that thing that's smothering you, the grief, the suffering. But God's still there. Like that blanket, that smothering blanket comes between you and God. But it doesn't stay there forever. And God has not turned his face away from you. And an amazing thing. We are, again, as Rob said last week, as Rob preached last week, I was thinking, stop it, you're pinching a lot of the things I want to say. But actually, it's not a bad thing, because these things can be repeated, because we need to hear them. Rob said last week, we're part of this wider family, and Hebrews 2 talks about being saved into this family. We have one another. And there are times when people are suffering, and so when I'm not happy, I don't want to be around people. When I'm happy, I often don't want to be around. I'm just being too honest sometimes, isn't it? No, I love people. It's fine. I'm a little bit of an introvert, so, I have to balance it out. We are saved into a family for a reason. There were times when people just sat with us and cried with us and didn't say anything. That's what we needed. When people are suffering, you don't have to come alongside them with words of wisdom. In fact, sometimes, please don't try. Because they will sound empty and trite. I didn't want people quoting scripture to me. I know it. I know that. But right now, it's not helping. But actually, just come and suffer with me. Because that helps.
That's true.
Come and show me that you feel that with me.
Yeah, it's true.
That helps. Because that's what happens, and that's what God does. Even if we don't feel he's there with us, he is there. And if it doesn't feel like he's speaking, it's because he knows that the words won't help right now. That all you need is him sitting with you, crying with you, weeping with you, shouting with you, getting angry with you. It's a powerful thing. So don't ever think you can't help someone who's suffering. Just sit with them and be with them. It's a powerful and wonderful thing. We may not ever know some of the reasons that we suffer. We may never know some of the reasons that bad things happen to us. Sometimes we go, oh, that's a good thing, and that wouldn't have happened without X, Y, or Z. But not always. And we have to learn to be okay with that. We have to learn to know that God's purposes are higher than our purposes, and we will never understand them. We can never understand them. We also sometimes don't like what God does. Well, nothing you can do about it. I don't like everything God does. But that's not his problem, that's my problem. So I want to begin to wrap this up. But the way I want to wrap this up is by now giving hope and encouragement. Because it doesn't end with suffering. It's really important that we end on hope. And I'm going to pinch a verse from later on in Hebrews. So if I meant to look at this before I came out, but whoever's doing Hebrews 12, I apologise, but I'm going to carry on anyway, which probably means I'm not that sorry. But, there we go. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 3 say this. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. I'm not going to talk about perseverance today, but that's another thing that I'm looking at the moment and I want to preach on at some point. It's perseverance. Anyway, let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And this is the bit. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. For the joy set before him. Let's not kid ourselves. The cross was not joyful. The cross was not joy. It was agony. Not just physical, but spiritual and emotional for Jesus. But it tells us he endured the cross for the joy that was set before him, for what came after. You see, we endure suffering now because we know it's not the end of the story. The end of the story is Jesus sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Glory, being glorified, being in victory. And while we may not feel that now, we go through the suffering now for the joy set before us of knowing that one day we will fully participate in that. It's promised to you. Hebrews 2 has shown us that today. Because Jesus became a man and suffered for us, we can say that it's done, but not yet fully seen. The devil is beaten, but we will still suffer. But it shows the trajectory that we're on. And this is really important. It shows where we were. It shows where we are. And it shows where we will be. That our suffering is not the end of the story because everything has been put under his feet. And in the Middle East, where this was written, that was massively significant. Some of you will be old enough to remember this when you get this right, when there's a big statue back in the Iraq War many years ago. This is not in my notes, it's just come to me, so forgive me if I get some of the detail wrong. The statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down and people beat it with their sandals. And you thought, a bit peculiar, but that was being put under their feet. It's shameful to be put under their feet. It means it's done, it's finished, it's at an end, it's the lowest. Everything's been put under Jesus' feet. So we, for the joy set before us, we will endure the suffering because eventually we will see that. We're promised it now, and we'll get to see it and experience it one day. There will come a day when we will stand in the presence of God, and every tear will be wiped away, and our joy will be complete. Oh, I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to that. You know, when I was thinking, how do I end this? How do I wrap this up? Well, that's a good place to wrap this up. That our joy will be complete. We will see it. We will get there. It's a promise of God. But then as we worshipped, I just felt God slip a couple of things into my head for people here. We sang the song, "My anchor holds within the veil." And you may be going through a tough time at the moment. You may be suffering right now. Or you may have recently suffered and just thinking, my anchor, I'm all at sea, I'm drifting. What anchor holds within the veil? I'm so far away from the veil, you wouldn't believe it. Think about the ship's anchor. When a ship is holding when an anchor is holding a ship, it's not actually anywhere near the ship. Your anchor is within the veil. You might be a long way away, but that's the purpose of the anchor, because it only lets you get to a certain point, and then it reels you in. That's the way a ship's anchor works. So I want to encourage you. Your anchor is within the veil, even if you feel a long way from the veil, which means the presence of God. So there are some here I want to encourage with that. And then also, we sang another song. Sing with me, how great is our God. Like I said before, there were times where I could not sing that. So why don't you come and sing with me? See, it's another part of being in the family. I couldn't sing it, but I stood with people who could. And people who could stood with me. And they encouraged me, come on, sing with me. Let me sing for you. Sing with me. How great is our God. Let others help. Let others come alongside you and let them help. Be vulnerable. It's not easy being vulnerable. I'll be honest with you, a number of years ago, before I was part of Jubilee, I couldn't preach in this way, being this vulnerable and open before people. Couldn't do it. There were lots of reasons for that, which I won't go into now, but God changes you. He also sets you in a place where it's safe to be vulnerable. Can I tell you, you are safe here when you're vulnerable, because you have people around you who will love you, who will not judge you. Goodness me, we sat down with Rob and Alison and with others, and Simon and Becky, lots of people. Well, not lots of people actually, but a few people. And I said some outrageous things about God. I was never judged. That's the quality of the people that are here. So can I encourage you? Be honest, be vulnerable before God and before others. And then one more thing. Don't compare your suffering to others' suffering. I hope that none of you suffer what we suffered. That's my hope. You will suffer different things, and you may go, well, yeah, but mine wasn't as bad as yours. And I used to think like this. I used to think, well, I need to count my blessings. I need to, I'm not that badly off, and almost negate what I was going through. And someone pointed out to me, no, that's what you're going through. That's real for you. It's real to you. Don't compare it to other people. What you're going through is real for you. There's not a scale on suffering with other people. There may be within yourself. Something might happen to you and you might go, yeah, okay, that's not nice, but it's not as bad as this, so I'm equipped to deal with it now. But you can't compare with other people, because you don't know what their history is. You don't know what God's doing in them. You don't know what they've suffered before and what they haven't suffered before. You don't know what their capacity is. So for you, don't judge your suffering against other people, but also let's not judge one another's suffering and go, why are they complaining about that? That's nothing.
Yes, true.
To them, that might be everything.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So let's not compare our suffering with one another.
Yes, true.
Let's just support one another.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's remember, Jesus identified with us.
Yes,
We can identify with him. And he has done everything needed for us. There's nothing more to be done but for us to keep our eyes on him and run the race with perseverance.
Thanks for listening. You can hear more talks and access our blog posts at jubileesolihull.org.